The Middle Ages was a time that reflects our own. Mythological creatures are returning to the present in different forms of media, and in some ways, the pagan religions of the past are making a return to the present. Legendary figures are reincarnated in our superheroes, and while quality of life has improved overall, death and life, now and 600 years ago, parallel each other. Good evening, everyone. My name is Boomslang. I've dedicated this video to going over a few strange aspects of the medieval era up into the Renaissance, including cultural superstitions, events, and artifacts. I hope you enjoy it. Cain is on the moon. This myth was maintained by a variety of different European countries and has multiple variations. The Slavic take on why the moon has its spots is based on the biblical tale of the first murder, in which Cain killed his brother Abel out of jealousy. One states that Cain is trapped on the moon, and that the spots dotting the lunar surface are the shed blood of Abel and the men that tried to kill Cain during his journeys. Even though it's contrary to the biblical canon, the Slavs held that Cain ran west. In the Bible, he went east until he reached the point where the moon touched the earth. There he waits until his return during Judgment Day. The Italian version, or should I say more like the Florentian version, widely told in Florence in the past, is also non-canonical to the Bible and is a creepier take on Cain's escape to the moon. In this timeline, God punishes Cain not only for the blood on his hands, but for his meddling in witchcraft and desire to have his brother's possessions. Cain killed his brother with a weapon fashioned from thorns in this story, and was punished by the thorns of the murder weapon being put on his head. He was sent to the moon, from which he could observe the goings-on on Earth. In addition, Cain could be taken from his imprisonment on the moon if he was summoned, but was at the whim of sorcerers and in pain from the thorns. This version feels more fitting to either Greek legends or the books by Dante. Rubezahl is a mountain spirit said to guard the Kirkonosze Mountains, located on the border between Poland and the Czech Republic. This figure was made most popular by ancient German tribes, and he appears prominently in German, Polish, and Czech folklore in this region. In the lore, he's seen as either a giant gnome, not the garden ones but creatures that were said to live deep underground, or a spirit of the mountains. Rubezahl is dangerous, punishing those who he perceives as trying to slight him, and sometimes helping those whom he comes across. He's often depicted as an old man wearing a cloak, and his nature is derived from the harsh weather he sends from the mountains, even when the sky is clear and the sun is out. Over time, his image has shifted from a creature that stalks the mountains to a protective figure who guards the fatherless and the poor. Despite his shifting character, people still treated him with respect recently, and travelers were admonished to refer to him as the Lord of the Mountain or the Treasure Keeper. The first time Rubezahl appeared in recorded literature was in a 1565 poem called Reminiscia. His story was first seen in the book De Monologica Rubenzali Celesi, published in the 1600s by Johannes Praetorius. He's even said to have inspired the character Ganondorf from the hit movie Lord of the Rings. Praetorius associated a malicious figure from this area, a malevolent being called the Night Huntsman, with Rubezahl. The Night Huntsman was a tale told to scare children, a rider that sounded his horn before initiating his hunt for the disobedient members of Silesian villages. Praetorius postulated that this cloaked figure was in fact the alter ego of the Lord of the Mountain. This small Gothic structure is a reliquary, a place in which a sacred relic is preserved. It contains a transparent rock crystal that in turn holds a tooth, and an inscription on the base identifies it as the reliquary of a tooth taken from the head of John the Baptist after his beheading at the hands of a ruler named Herod. Produced in Germany in 1433, what made this object interesting to me was the sources of its construction. The rock crystal has been dated to the Middle East and was refined in the 1st century AD, yet its components range from Africa to Germany. I'd like to see a montage of all the places the reliquary components went before arriving and being put together. Hildebrandsled. This is an 8th century poem in which a father fights his son. The poem was originally recorded in Old High German in a monastery in southern Germany. The original was far older than the version we have today, and the ending of the poem has been lost to time. The story tells of a young warrior whose father had left his mother when the warrior was but an infant. Hildebrand was this warrior's name, and after he grew up, he set out to challenge the champion of the Huns, who were invading his tribe's territory. The champions examined their gear and sharpened their weapons, and as they prepared for battle, the other warrior, who was far older, asked Hildebrand who his father was and from which family he was descended. The older warrior, named Hildebrand, said, "Just tell me about your father, and I'll know his name. I fought all throughout Europe." This is my paraphrasing through here. Hildebrand said, "My elders say that my father left long ago and set off with his warriors into the Far East, leaving me and my mother to live in poverty. My father had a friend named Dietrich, a man who had many enemies. He fought for Dietrich in many battles and was seen in the front lines at all times. He is dead, along with Dietrich." Hildebrand does his best to stop this fight with his own son, and pulls some beautiful golden armbands braided from gold, gifts from the king of the Huns, and says, "A man should never go into battle against his own kin." His son rejected the gifts and said, "A gift from a crafty old Hun like yourself should be met with a spear." Hildebrand is still dead. His father compliments his battle gear and tells of how he survived his supposed death at the hands of the Huns, became one of their finest duelists. It's been 30 years since the two have seen each other, and the son cannot be convinced. The father accepts the duel. The two take combat stances and strike each other's shields, and the poem ends there. They left us on a cliffhanger. This entire poem was actually used as the binding for another later book, and it's an active chance that we even have access to this poem in the first place. Tradition says that the father kills his son, but a sequel, a quite literal monk fanfic, was published in the 13th century and ended the story with a happy reconciliation between the two. King On is a figure wreathed in bloody legend. Called the Aged, he gained infamy for sacrificing his sons to Odin in exchange for an extended life. In his first sacrifice, he gave up his eldest son in a ceremony in which he slaughtered hundreds of animals upon a burning pyre, and then his eldest son. Odin promised that On would live for another 60 years, provided he sacrificed more of his sons every 10 years. On used 9 of his sons for this purpose before his people stopped him from killing his last descendant. On did live for well over 120 years, but his body degraded and began to decay. A Swedish poem recounts the story in a rhyme that tells of how he became increasingly more feeble. In Uppsala town, the cruel king slaughtered his sons at Odin's shrine, slaughtered his sons with cruel knife, to get from Odin length of life. He lived until he had to turn his toothless mouth to the deer's horn, and he who shed his children's blood sucked through the ox's horn his food. At length, fell death has tracked him down, slowly but sure, in Uppsala town. In essence, What is a long life worth if it is maintained at the cost of everything you love? This story was published in a book from 1899, and it was said that the king passed away in the 5th century AD. The Hellmouth is a physical representation of an entrance into the underworld that can be found in many paintings from the later medieval era. It's gruesome, a toothy mouth that almost reminds me of a lamprey in some depictions. The Hellmouth was a gruesome reminder for those who engaged in prayer for the dead in many churches. They had like this constant reminder of their dead relatives suffering if they didn't pray. The great reformer Martin Luther often saw these images as something that detracted from the promise of Christianity. His thought is, why should I constantly be scared when I go into church if Christ has won and if my soul is saved? Interestingly, the Hellmouth was a popular stage piece for medieval plays. Actors dressed as devils would often emerge from these booths, accompanied by fireworks and smoke. Traditionally seen as a maw that sucked victims in, this gate is seen more as a place from which monsters emerge to challenge mankind. This can be seen in games like Doom 2016, or even the resurrection of Ichabod Crane from the underworld in some versions of the legend of Sleepy Hollow. This image was something interesting I found while looking into this design. This print was made by a German artist named Matthias Kusel, was the concept for a set piece by the artist Ludovico Bernacini. It was intended for an opera and depicts demons circling a massive hellmouth while the ferryman of the underworld floats down a fiery Styx. This is a TO map, designed to be a clear and concise guide to the world in a glance. Named after its shape, the TO map's lines delineated the 3 known continents, with Asia placed on the top, Europe and Africa flanking the left and right sides of the T. The Mediterranean, Don, and Nile separate the 3. Jerusalem is often placed in the middle, as it was a site of ritual significance. In slightly more complex TO maps, places like Noah's Ark and the earthly paradise were placed in each of the divided areas. The trials by ordeal were a series of laws that served to indict those accused of a crime. They were used in many countries before the advent of the jury and other more humane and regulated forms of judgment. The 3 primary categories were combat, divination, and physical testing. The trial by combat was the most common. 2 individuals involved with a controversial claim, most often men, were put in a fight to the death. Whoever won was declared to have the favor of whatever divine pantheon or being was being worshipped in the area. These didn't always end in death. Oftentimes, if the loser survived, they were often let free after their possessions were taken away or their hand was taken from them. Physical tests were most common, were either administered with fire or water. Individuals were often forced to hold a heated up piece of metal and told to walk for a certain distance. The bar was taken from them and their wounds were bandaged. After 3 days, the bandages were removed. If the person's wounds had healed, they were determined innocent. If their wounds had remained open, it was determined that they were guilty. Trial by water is something you've most likely seen before. In this, the accused was bound by hand and foot and thrown into a body of water. They were often hooked up to a rope so that they could be pulled up if they began to sink beneath the surface. If they floated, they were considered to be partaking in witchcraft or sorcery. Information on trials by divination had the least information of the topics I researched for this part of the video. These typically happened in areas outside of Christendom and either involved chants or consulting the dead. Keep the latter one in mind, I'll talk about that later. The Burmese, who were very close to the area where my ancestors were from, would often gather the 2 parties involved in a case together. Two members of the respective parties would each hold a candle of the same size and diameter, and both would be lit simultaneously. Whoever's candle lasted the longest was considered to be backed up by the gods. The article didn't discuss what would happen if there was interference from someone blowing out the candle, or opening a window to let in wind that would snuff the candle, or what would happen if one of the candles was dropped and then caused a fire, but I'm sure there were stipulations for that. Now that we've discussed the more well-known ones, we can get on with a couple of more obscure ways of enacting justice. Charlemagne, the founder of the Holy Roman Empire, disdained the fact that he was losing so many valuable warriors to the trials by combat. He needed more trained warriors. He was tired of them killing each other over spoils, women, or imagined wrongs and grievances. He imposed the Ordeal of the Cross, a contest in which two men would assume the position of the crucifixion, and whoever dropped their arms first was considered guilty. Make all the jokes about T-posing you want, but by the end of it, the two contestants would have had a decent lat and shoulder workout. The ordeal by cheese was a more recent invention in Europe. Individuals were ordered to stuff their mouths with cheese, or in some cases, bread. If they could say the oath of innocence after the judge, they were considered innocent. If they choked or spat, they were indicted as being guilty. These ordeals met their end in the 13th century, when the Pope and many of the political leaders of Europe declared that all these acts did was test God with pagan source traditions. I decided to give the topic of the ordeal of the undead its own section. Or wait, not undead, dead. Sorry, that's a script problem. Along with some of the other trials, questioning the dead has been a staple of Western culture for millennia. Odysseus, Aeneas, and if I can remember correctly, Hercules consulted the dead for directions and help with completing the tasks they had set out to do. In many places, the dead are considered far more knowledgeable than the living, and often have valuable information on the past, present, and future. Contact with the dead was typically established by sacrificing animals to attract the spirits of priests or prophets from the underworld. Pagan cultures relied on the dead to offer judgment or to precognate on future events. By the 1500s, this type of magic to summon the dead was actively prohibited by many European authorities and seen as a cultural taboo. Despite this, many still engage in the old pagan rituals by contacting the dead with blood sacrifices. Ancestor worship still existed, and spirits were often called upon to rule on cases, protect their relatives, or enact supernatural vengeance against their opponents. The Order of St. Lazarus was an order of knights designated to administer care to the leprous members of the city of Jerusalem. Many of the knights who cared for the sick were lepers themselves. Founded in 1098 AD, the order originated from a single hospital in Jerusalem, later expanding to include other facilities throughout the Christian kingdoms in the Mediterranean. The order became militarized in the 12th century, and later expanded to assist the Crusaders and provide for lepers throughout Europe. They were healers, but took up arms against enemy forces at many different points. The Knights later formed an alliance with the Templar Order, which led to them being investigated after the Templars were condemned of heresy. The Order fell into obscurity after the fall of the Templars and the end of the Crusades, due to their lack of available funds. They still exist as a volunteer organization, underneath the jurisdiction of the Catholic Church. A small village, named Mamouthounes, on the Mediterranean island of Sardinia, is the center of an ancient pagan ritual that involves bizarre and terrifying masks. Typically taking place on the Feast of St. Anthony, the light and dark are represented in a ceremony that takes place as spring arrives and winter leaves. While the celebrations center around the village, Bonfires can be seen throughout Sardinia to commemorate the older pagan festival. The men of the village don ceremonial garb to represent Mamuthones and Issahadores, representations of the light and the dark. The Mamuthones wear these grotesque masks covered in slick paint, and they represent the people living in the kingdom of the dead, as well as the relationship between the herdsman and the flock he protects. They have heavy cowbells along their back to represent that, along with draped cloth hoods and dark sheep pelts. The Issahadores wear red tunics and wear bell-covered sashes along their outfit. They represent the living. The procession begins at the village church, and 12-person groups of the Mamuthones are led by a single Issahadore and proceed through the village from the afternoon until the evening, until each of the ceremonial fires have been rekindled by the marchers. These fires are spread all throughout the countryside and around the village. The Mamuthones are arranged in 2 rows of 6 people, representing the 2 halves of the year, and move slowly with more somber movements. The Issahadores dance and catch young women with grass ropes, representing fertility and spring. The Mamuthones are wearing around 60 pounds of copper with the bells, so it takes them a while to process onwards. The celebration begins wherever these groups march, so parties of revelers collect around the procession. The ceremony dates back some 2,000 years, and is thought by many to be a creation of the indigenous people. Chester Le Street was a compelling local tradition originating from the Middle Ages that was last played in 1932. Taking place in the town of the same name, a game of football was played by an unlimited number of players. Anyone who wanted to play could join the game. It took place annually, and the people who participated were split into 2 teams, the Upstreeters and Downstreeters. The matches would begin at 1 in the afternoon, and the ball was thrown out of a window from a building in the center of town. Both teams would do their best to keep the ball within their side. When the game ended at 6 p.m., whoever had it on their side was declared the victor. The game was recorded to have had over 400 participants in some years. The state of the Teutonic Order was a crusader state established by the Teutonic Knights in the 13th century during the Northern Crusades against the pagan Old Russian tribes. Called the Civitas Ordinis Teutonicus, its territory extended to include the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, along with parts of modern Poland and Russia. German colonization occurred afterwards, with limited success. The epic-sounding knightly order of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword had defended the Christian villages for many years. They made an agreement with the Teutonic Knights to help occupy the area. Villages were fortified, and the Knights constructed the foundations for organized cities from which they could expand to establish a presence. The native Old Prussians and Russian tribes offered tough resistance to the occupiers, providing plenty of work for the Knights and their supporters. The Knights started a war with the Polish, and after a series of brutal losses, the Teutonic state fell into disrepair. I thought it was interesting that these orders attempted to colonize regions all over Europe. Predjama Castle is a castle placed halfway up a 403-foot-tall cliff. Constructed in the mouth of a cavern, the castle was built in stages, beginning in 1202. It saw its most modern incarnation built in the Renaissance era. A local robber baron named Lager used the fortifications to provide a base of operations for his raids across Slovenia in the midst of a war that was occurring between the Hungarians and Austrians. He came into conflict with the Austrians after killing one of their senior commanders. After the Holy Roman Emperor called for his death, Lager retreated to this area and was killed after a long siege. The robber used the deep caverns beneath the castle as a way to access the outside world during the siege. The caverns extend for some 8 miles, meaning that he had plenty of space in which his followers could place supplies and build escape shafts. George R.R. Martin visited this site and modeled one of his castles in Westeros on this one. Okay, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video and want to support the channel, the best thing you can do to support me is subscribe and check out some of the other things I've made. I'll see you soon. Take care and good night.